You can take as many drugs as you want. You will remain biologically what you are from the day you were born. You're not assigned sex. Your sex is what you are born and what you are created as. Okay?
And as I said, you're citing biological facts based on a discredited.
It's not discredited, darling. It's biological
truth. Very complex body.
This is where we start from.
Phenomena
if we
and
can't,
physical organs.
If we can't even start from
the very
biological
conversation we're having just now.
This exchange exposes the real fault line in the Scottish gender recognition argument. Is this primarily about making life easier for transgender people? Or about what happens when one government's reforms collide with sex-based protections written into UK-wide law? The guest frames the issue around dignity, mental strain, and reducing what he sees as unnecessary barriers for people seeking legal recognition. But the presenter keeps dragging the discussion back to something much harder to avoid. Westminster's responsibility for reserved equality law, the implications for women's spaces, and whether simplifying self-identification can create consequences beyond the individual making that declaration. And that is where the argument becomes politically significant. Compassion for transgender people does not automatically answer questions about safeguarding prisons, medical treatment, or the constitutional limits of devolution. Equally, raising those concerns does not justify treating every transgender person as a threat. The serious issue is whether Scotland could change this framework without creating conflicts the rest of the UK would then be expected to absorb. If you want more debates where the slogans are stripped away and the policy consequences are actually examined, subscribe to Debate Central, hit like, and tell me whether you think Westminster was right to intervene. Now watch this exchange.
Not allowing them in the women's prisons would help.
But you're not letting me speak. You're not letting me speak at all.
I think the government in the UK did the right thing blocking this law. It's a law that shouldn't be in place in Scotland, let alone have any impact over the border into England and Wales. This is about British equalities legislation. That is in the purview of the UK Westminster government, not of the Scottish government in Holyrood. In which case, why is this stoking a culture war when the government is simply just enacting the devolution settlement, which was already in place?
Well, let's be clear who we're talking about, first of all, Julia, and we're talking about a group of people that have to go through needless medical processes which induce a significant amount of emotional strain and mental turmoil in an era where we're looking after mental health.
I was going to say, are you talking about Scottish MPs or are you talking about trans people?
I'm talking about the trans community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to supplement that point, I think it's twofold. Well, first and foremost, I'm a sufferer of ME, which is an invisible disability, and I know a thing or two about mental toil and emotional disruption when it comes to things like misdiagnosis and unnecessary lengthy periods of time where you're trying to figure out what's wrong with you and you're having GPs telling you stop being ridiculous. It's probably in your own head.
Okay, let's not get signed on it. As you say, this is young people currently having to undergo, you say, needless medical processes. If someone says that they believe they are born in the wrong body, that is what it used to be called, you have a medical diagnosis of something called gender dysphoria, because no one is born in the wrong body. You're born a man, you're born a woman. A tiny percentage of people are born non-binary. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about trans. Someone believing they're born... It's a different thing.
Sorry to interrupt you, Julia, but it's interesting that you're citing biological facts from a widely discredited metaphysical view of the human body. We know that the human body isn't just our physical organs. We know that we have a complex relationship with our mental phenomena. You study philosophy. Think back to your metaphysics lessons when you were learning about this.
Innes, there is nothing controversial for 95% of people in this country, but I would think 99% if they really had to be pushed on it, about whether or not you're being male or female is a biological fact and is a physical fact. So people are born what they are and they remain that for their whole life. You can cut things off, you can do other things, you can take as many drugs as you want. You will remain biologically what you are from the day you were born. You're not assigned sex. Your sex is what you are born and what you are created as. Okay?
And as I said, you're citing biological facts based on a discredited...
It's not discredited, darling. It's biological truth.
Very complex body.
This is where we start
mental
from.
Phenomena
if we
and
can't,
physical organs.
If we can't even start from
the
biological
conversation we're having just now is exchanging ideas. It's mental phenomena, and the relationship we have with our physical organs is complex. Okay. If you can't accept that, you're denying reality.
Yes, and I'm probably transphobic for it as well. I'm not denying reality. That's the reality.
What I said to you, but you're denying biological facts.
How you feel inside is completely different from the reality of your biological body and your chromosomes.
Well, how do you explain pain? How do you explain the sensory experience that we experience with pain, which at times falsely experiences what's wrong with our body?
Innes, we've got 3 minutes left. Can we talk about the actual subject at hand? Okay. You say these are
but this is the crux.
Innes,
it's
not the crux of it. Innes,
it's
not your podcast, darling. I'm asking you.
Reality.
I don't know why I even bother. You can't. I mean, let's deny the reality of 2 + 2 = 4 as well. I mean, we can argue about that, but it's a waste of everyone's time.
You're citing a widely discredited medical view of the human body.
It's not discredited. Needless medical I'm still trying to ask the second question. Needless medical processes, you say. They're not needless. Someone who's got gender dysphoria needs to be given a lot of psychological help. I don't believe that certainly 16-year-olds should be given any sort of medical treatment, because we know how damaging that can be. Ability to decide to be infertile for the rest of your life, I think, is something that a 16-year-old is not equipped to do. But when the Scottish Government doesn't have these powers, equalities legislation is reserved for the Westminster Government. The Westminster Government is entitled to slap that down, and when that impacts on women and girls in particular, the risk to them in their safe spaces, they're even more entitled to slap it down, aren't they?
But the problem with that argument is you're pretending that these issues only exist in a world where the ability to self-ID is eased, but it's not. We still have these issues. Why are we having this conversation? Why aren't we having the conversation that we're feared that a male pervert might be waiting there in the toilet? Why are we?
It's actually happened. That's why.
But
it's actually happening. It's happening in prisons. It's happening in women's safe spaces every day.
Look at Ireland, who have had the self-ID bill for 7 years. They've never had to revoke someone's gender certificate because it's never happened. The evidence is
happening right now. There have been court cases about it. There are ongoing cases right now going through the courts where this has happened. You can't deny that reality, or you're denying every reality.
Well, of course it's going through the courts, because prisons take each case by case.
No, there have been convictions.
Why would I deny that?
People, male sexual predators behind bars in male prisons have self-identified as women, got themselves transferred to women's prisons and have sexually assaulted women. That's a fact.
And there's nothing to suggest that we can't clamp down on it, but to further alienate a community,
not allowing them in the women's prisons would help.
Well, you're not letting me speak. You're not letting me speak at all. To impose significant mental turmoil.
And this is where the argument becomes much more important than the shouting match itself. Because the real dispute is not simply whether transgender people deserve dignity or support. They do. The harder question is who gets to change the legal framework, what happens when devolved policy collides with UK-wide equality law, and who carries the consequences when those systems do not line up cleanly. The guest's argument is built around reducing what he sees as unnecessary bureaucracy and emotional strain. That is a legitimate concern. If a legal recognition process is needlessly slow, degrading or confusing, there is a reasonable case for reform. But reform does not happen in a vacuum. Scotland can legislate in devolved areas, but equality law is reserved to Westminster. That means any change touching the operation of protected characteristics across Britain immediately becomes more complicated than a simple question of local autonomy. The constitutional issue is not decorative, it is central. And that is why the UK government's intervention was politically significant. The argument from Westminster was effectively that Scotland's proposed reform could create consequences beyond Scotland's own institutions, particularly where legal sex recognition interacts with Equality Act protections elsewhere in Great Britain. Whether every claimed consequence would actually materialise is debatable, but the constitutional principle is clear. A devolved parliament cannot simply legislate as though reserved law does not exist. That is where the presenter has the stronger line of attack, because once you move from individual identity to prison single-sex services, medical treatment, safeguarding, and employment law, the system needs definitions that institutions can actually apply. And this is where rhetoric about compassion can become evasive if it is used to avoid practical questions. You can sympathize with somebody experiencing gender dysphoria. You can oppose cruelty or humiliation. You can believe the process for legal recognition should be humane. And you can still ask whether sex-based protections remain meaningful. If the legal threshold for changing sex status becomes too detached from objective criteria. Those are not mutually exclusive positions. The guest also pushes heavily on the psychological burden of waiting, periods and medical processes. Again, that deserves to be taken seriously. But one of the most revealing moments in the clip is when the discussion turns to age and medical intervention. That is where political certainty should give way to caution. A 16-year-old can have very strong and sincere feelings about identity. That does not automatically resolve questions about long-term medical consequences. Fertility, consent, or whether distress has other contributing factors. Any responsible system has to separate compassion from haste. The fact that somebody is distressed does not mean every intervention they request is automatically appropriate. That principle applies across medicine, and it is especially important when the decision may have consequences that cannot easily be reversed. The prison issue is another example of why this debate cannot be handled with slogans. The presenter raises cases involving male prisoners identifying as women and being placed in female prisons. The guest responds by saying such cases can be handled individually, but that answer itself concedes the point that category boundaries matter. If each case must be risk assessed because biological sex can affect safeguarding, then the policy cannot pretend sex is irrelevant. That does not mean every transgender prisoner is dangerous. It means prison policy has to balance identity with risk, vulnerability, history of offending, and the safety of other inmates. That is what serious administration looks like. And politically, this entire debate reveals a broader problem that has damaged trust in both Westminster and Holyrood. Too often, one side talks as though any concern about sex-based boundaries is prejudice, while the other side talks as though every transgender person represents a threat. Both approaches flatten reality. The public is more capable of nuance than that. Most voters can understand that transgender people deserve protection from harassment and discrimination. They can also understand that sex remains relevant in certain legal and practical contexts. The political failure begins when institutions insist that one of those truths must cancel out the other. That is why this argument keeps returning. It is not simply because politicians want another culture war, although some undoubtedly benefit from the confrontation. It is because the underlying legal and practical conflict is real and cannot be permanently solved by changing the language. Westminster has constitutional responsibilities. Holyrood has devolved powers. Equality law has UK-wide consequences. And individuals have rights that sometimes collide. The job of government is to resolve those collisions clearly, lawfully, and proportionately. Not by pretending the conflict does not exist. Not by smearing everyone who raises a concern. And not by treating compassion as a substitute for policy. That is the real lesson from this exchange. The question was never simply, do you support transgender people? The question was, how do you write a law that protects transgender people without creating new uncertainty or weakening the protections of others? And until politicians can answer that directly, this debate will continue to generate exactly the kind of distrust you just watched on screen.